Few moments in history carry the same weight as the dawn of the atomic age. In August of 1945, the world changed forever when the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ushering humanity into an era where single decisions could determine the fate of millions. But behind the public triumph, the military secrecy, and the political calculations was a far more complicated reality. A president suddenly burdened with a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. My guest today is Alex Wellerstein, historian, professor, and one of the leading voices on the history of nuclear weapons and the atomic age. His newest book, The Most Awful Responsibility: Truman and the Secret Struggle for Control of the Atomic Age, explores the hidden political and moral battle that unfolded behind closed doors as Truman grappled with the terrifying power of atomic weapons and the question of who exactly should control them. Far from a simple story of scientific progress or wartime necessity, the book reveals a tense struggle involving generals, scientists, and politicians, and intelligence officers, all attempting to shape the future of nuclear power in the uncertain years after the war. It's a story about secrecy, fear, power, and the realization that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Today we'll talk about Truman's unexpected inheritance of the bomb after FDR and the hidden conflicts surrounding the early atomic program, the personalities who fought to control nuclear policy, and how those first decisions continue to shape the modern world. I hope you guys enjoy. A quick word from our sponsors. Alex, welcome to History Shorts.
Thanks so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
This is awesome. So let's start with your story. How did you so imagine a young Alex. How did you get involved, right, in just, research about nuclear weapons and how did that become your passion, I guess? It sounds weird, right? Your passion is nuclear weapon research. And then how does that translate to this book?
So I think sometimes people want a story here where it's like I was born inside a nuclear bomb and that's why I do what I do. But the truth is, I got very interested in history as a college student because it felt not just interesting but powerful. That the versions of the past that we tell are, especially if they're about something we care about, they actually change how we think about the world, how we think about the present, how we think about the future. And I got really interested in history and I studied it. And I stumbled just totally serendipitously on this field called the history of science and technology, which is studying the history of science, which should be straightforward, but people are often kind of confused by this. But it's scientists and the development of technology and how these things work together and things like this. And I just thought, oh, that's fascinating because I'm very interested in science and technology, but I have like no mathematical skills and no laboratory skills. And so, like, there was never any chance of me doing that. But here I get to sort of vicariously do that. And from there, I sort of got very interested in nuclear weapons just because they present interesting dilemmas for thinking about the social uses of science and technology. Nuclear weapons are the only case I really know of where some scientists in a very small laboratory discover some new fact about the universe. And then the conclusion within like 5 years is we need to redo all of international politics and human beings can't do the same thing they were doing anymore. And that's wild. And that's fascinating. And ultimately, why do I do that among as opposed to anything else I'm interested in? Once you start doing something for a while, that becomes your thing. And I have never gotten bored with nuclear weapons. If I ever do, maybe I'll shift. But it's very interesting to me. It's inherently interesting. So I feel very privileged that I can spend my time thinking about these things, even though they're awful things.
So what made you like go back to this, you might say the big moment, right? When it comes to the history of nuclear weapons, which is you might almost say the beginning, I guess. What made you turn this into a book?
I when I started working on this, I had basically thought I will never work on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I will never work on the decision to drop the bomb because that has been gone over by so many people for so many years, and they have all these arguments, and they're interesting. But what are the odds that you're going to have something that you feel like is novel to say about this? And I came to it just very, I mean, most of the ideas I have are serendipitous. I'm looking for something else, or I have some other idea, and I stumble across something interesting that I'm not really looking for. And it pricks up something in the back of my neck. And I think, well, that's interesting. Why is that not what I expected it to be? And then I start scratching at it for 5, 10 years. And then suddenly a book comes out, basically. But the thing I was looking into is this story, which is often a footnote in the history of the atomic bombings, which is the sparing of Kyoto. So the Secretary of War did not want the city of Kyoto to be bombed, and he got Truman to agree to take it off the list. This is sort of referenced occasionally. There's like one line in the Oppenheimer movie about Kyoto. And I was just thought, well, let's just take a look at this. I wonder if that's like the full story. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that, oh, not only is this story much more interesting than I realized. It is not just some little aside. And also, he didn't say take Kyoto off the list and it was done. I mean, there was this protracted attempt by the military to put it back on the list. Him going, Stimson going to Truman to get it off the list was sort of a final act of desperation because they kept trying to put it back on. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting thing by itself. But then the more I looked into it, the more I thought, oh my God, I actually think that this is not the footnote. This is the story. This is the only direct decision about the use of the atomic bomb that Truman actually takes part in. And as I argue in the book, I think he actually misunderstands the whole conversation. And I thought, oh my God. And so I sat on this for some years and presented it and tried to, flesh it out. And like, is this for real? Is this actually a sane interpretation? And I, in the end, concluded like, yeah, I actually think this holds up. And the more I worked on it, the more I thought, yeah, this is actually a very different way to think about Truman and the bomb. And it changes quite a lot of the story. And I should write this up as a book. And so I did. So again, I would not have expected to ever want to work on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I did not seek out that topic, but it sort of came to me as it was.
Wow. A couple of things to unpack here, and you kind of followed up with what my second question is about what decisions does he actually make, right? Because it's so misinterpreted. What I've been teaching for years in a classroom, and that is always the discussion lesson of Truman dropping a bomb. Should he? Should he? There's always a primary documents, as much as always thought that it included all these documents, until I read your book, I realized that it was always so superficial. Like, was it the
Yeah.
right thing or the wrong thing? It was, it's a deep question, but it never actually got into this idea of what decisions, what was he making? On a side note as well, I recently visited the B-29 boxcar that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. I have a book coming out this August called 8 Days in August, and it's about,
Mhm.
the last week of World War II. And I wound up applying and asking like a year ago to get permission to get on board of this aircraft. And after a year, they finally granted me permission. They were super
Wow.
nice. So I got to go on board of the boxcar. The guy that showed me around was a radiation expert, awesome guy. And he was like, "You want to do something cool?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he like puts the flashlight on, and everything's glowing. I'm like, "What is happening?" Like, "Okay, we're good enough. I had what I needed. We could go now." But it was quite an experience to say to say the least. Um, so one of the book's big interventions that Truman didn't actually make the decision to drop the bomb, right? It was in a way that most people assume. Can you kind of like walk us through what Truman did and didn't decide and how that misunderstanding actually took hold?
Yeah. So by the time Truman took president after Roosevelt died, so this is April 1945, a lot of progress had already been made on making the atomic bomb. They had already started thinking about how to use the atomic bomb, and by they I mean several groups of people more directly connected to the Manhattan Project. So one easy way to think about it is there's the sort of General Groves side of things, which also includes Oppenheimer and scientists and things like that, which is very focused on the operational details. Where's this bomb? How's this bomb going to go off? What height should it be detonated at? How are you going to get the pieces of the bomb out to the Pacific and assemble them safely? And what kind of facilities do you need out there? And all that kind of very practical stuff. You also have the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who is very concerned with sort of big picture, strategic almost historical ideas. I mean, Stimson really believes that this is not just a weapon. This is a new era of human history. He is very invested in thinking about how this weapon that they're making for the war is going to be turned into this sort of agent of diplomacy after the war. Um, and so they have various committees between these sort of two poles. They have various discussions going on. Roosevelt was not that involved with either of those. And if he was involved, it was mostly with the Stimson stuff, and it was sort of very abstract at that point. By the time Truman is president, they sort of bring him in on this, but he doesn't really have a lot of connection to it. It's not clear that Truman really understands all of it that well or believes all of it that well. You have to just imagine this would have sounded fantastical, and that if any of your cabinet members as a president show up to you on not quite day one, but pretty basically day one, and tell you that, like, oh, we have a science fiction weapon and it's going to change everything about the world, or we're all going to go extinct. Like, you're going to have a little skepticism, especially when the guy's like 80 years old and, maybe has gotten confused about things. Anyway, Truman is basically not that involved for all of that period. There's very few signs that he's even really taking the atomic bomb into any kind of consideration, taking it at all seriously. The only thing he really does that makes it seem like he's somewhat interested, he deliberately delays the date of the Potsdam Conference a little bit so that they'll have time to test the bomb, because he's curious about whether this thing is going to work or not. And if it does, that might impact negotiations and decisions and things. At the Potsdam Conference, this is when the Trinity test happens. He is amazed by the Trinity test and the descriptions he gets. He is fascinated. It comes at a period in which he's feeling kind of low and not with a lot of leverage. And suddenly everybody around him remarks that, like, oh my gosh, Truman just totally changes in one day. He becomes confident. He's telling the Soviets what they have to do. He doesn't want to give the Japanese any slack. He's like ready to go. He's thrilled. And so this is when Truman actually starts to really care and take seriously the atomic bomb. And it's right around this moment that this question of should the first target of the bomb be Kyoto, a big urban cultural center, former capital of Japan, or Hiroshima, a much smaller city with military installations in it and factories and things like this. And that debate over what the targets even should be, that predates, Truman's not involved with any of that. That's, again, Stimson and Groves and other discussions. The question of whether they're going to use the bomb, those guys have already taken for granted that that's going to be the case. It's not clear that Truman is ever, that there's no decision presented to Truman. It's never, oh, what do you think we ought to do? It's, here are our plans. And Truman basically, as Groves later puts it, it's a policy of non-interference. He's not changing the plans as he understands them. And the one place in which he does is this question on Kyoto. And that's because Stimson comes to him and basically says, the military, I don't know if we don't actually know exactly what he says, but he's basically saying the military keeps wanting to put Kyoto on this list. I don't think it should be on this list. And he gets Truman to agree with him, because then Stimson can go back to the military and say, I have the highest level of authority on this, because the military clearly do not respect Stimson's authority to select targets, which is a whole other can of worms. And Truman is very pleased by this decision not to bomb Kyoto. And then the question for me is, what does he think he's actually done? Does he think that he has chosen from one city to another city? My reading of the evidence in the book has a lot of this in it. And again, I don't expect anybody, I always say this, but I don't expect anybody listening to me to believe me. You have to actually look at the evidence, and I can't convince you in 10 minutes. It's just not going to happen. But if you look at what Truman says to people and writes down at the time before Hiroshima, I think the balance of the evidence, at least in my eyes, reflects that he believes that this conversation was about whether the first bomb should be used on a city or not, whether it should be used on, as he put it, a purely military target, a military base. So I don't think he realizes that there will be lots of civilian casualties at Hiroshima. He makes it pretty clear that he does not think there's going to be a lot of them, and that this is this sort of thing that will be seen in a good light later, that the United States chose to use the bomb in this way. And then, of course, that's not true. Hiroshima is a city, 90% civilian, tens of thousands, potentially up to 100,000 casualties or so, or fatalities. but that's basically my argument about what he does in this period. After Hiroshima, he has no input on Nagasaki whatsoever. I don't think he knows it's coming. The schedule is one that changed, the actual use schedule. I don't think he understood there were two types of bombs that were going to be ready within a couple days of each other. They don't tell him before Nagasaki that they're about to drop another one. I don't think they felt they needed to. But then the other thing he does in this period is on August 10th, he gives an order that says no more atomic bombs will be dropped. And this is in part because the military have told him they're going to have another one ready in a week. And he says, no further bombs will be dropped. The express permission of the president will be necessary. He tells his, if you're going to use any more, he tells his cabinet that he does this because he can't stand the thought of killing another 100,000 people, as he puts it, all those kids. So it's about these non-combatant casualties. And then from that moment onward, that is when the president is sort of in charge of whether atomic bombs are being used or not from August 10th onward. Not before, which is the interesting bit. Now, if Truman had come out and said, don't use the bomb, I'm sure they would have obeyed him. But it never comes up as a sort of choice in that respect. The choice is between Kyoto and Hiroshima. And again, I conclude that he misunderstood that conversation with Stimson about what the nature of that choice was.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point too, because he's always the buck stops here kind of a president, and the second these bombs are dropped, he basically has to defend what becomes the biggest decision of his entire political career. And there's this concept of it that every time I kind of would go and teach this, my students would say, "Well, he said flat out, he goes, I don't regret it. I would drop it again." Like very cocky, like this was no big deal. I made the decision to save lives. But your book points out that actually there's a lot of nuance to this. This is a guy that does feel like I don't want to lose human lives. Who's going to control the nuclear proliferation? Who's going to control these weapons? How do we limit this? What hands, whose hands is this going to be in? And it kind of shows a more conflicted person, right? Like, how does this event change him going forward for the remainder of his presidency with how he approaches nuclear weapons?
It's complex, and he is complex. He has a reputation for being a simple president, and in some ways, he is more simple than some of the other presidents. He's certainly more straightforward than like Roosevelt, who's just like endless, machinations within machinations and things like that. Truman, that's not his approach to the world. He's not strategic in that respect. He's much more a Midwesterner. He's also the last president who did not have any kind of college education, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, he always defends the use of the bomb, especially after the war, especially after his presidency. He does not tolerate anybody second guessing him. That's just his personality in general. He has no time for Monday morning quarterbacking, right? He just thinks this is stupid. You have no idea what it's like to be president. And, as president, he was very clear to people that he did not really know what he was doing, and he did not know what the right answer was, which is true. Like, he's facing incredible difficulties. What do you do about the Berlin airlift? What do you do about the Korean War? There's no easy answers to these questions, and the results are unsatisfying even to him in many cases. But I think it's also, again, really interesting that when he's talking about the atomic bomb in the abstract, when he's not talking about the question of should we have dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which he always said yes, and he always took credit for doing it. And again, I think it's the buck stops here and the sort of civic ideal he has where the president is responsible and needs to sort of represent the nation's interests in a certain way. I think that's what's leading him to always defend it. But when he talks about it in both public and private, especially during his presidency, it talks about atomic bombs in the abstract. It's not the language that people use when they are usually in favor of nuclear weapons or defending Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, it's astounding some of the words he uses for this. I like to just quote them sometimes where it's like, well, he describes atomic bombs as weapons that slaughter the civilian population by the wholesale, as weapons that murder women and children, that are not military weapons. This is not how people defend the bombing talk about atomic bombs. Like, if I were using this language now, people would think like, well, this is a man who really hates nuclear weapons. Right. That's Harry Truman's language. It's fascinating. Right. And he also said many, many times, and I think this is actually quite true to his heart. He says this again, both in public and in private. We know the private because people kept diaries of these conversations. Um, but he would tell people that, you know, the day after World War II, he resolved that they would never use nuclear weapons again if they could possibly do it. And by they, he means the United States. During his presidency, even though the Soviets do get nuclear weapons, Truman's totally in denial about it. He's in denial about it, and even into after he's president, which is just a bizarre psychological thing to think about. He really believes that the only people who are going to use nuclear weapons are Americans, and he's very dead set against that for strictly moral reasons. He just doesn't think that slaughtering civilians, which is what he associates atomic bombs with, is something you can do. And so to me, that's sort of the interesting paradox here is how does Truman have the reputation as like the president who uses the atomic bomb, which, you know, fair in certain ways, but he's also in his language, he's probably the most anti-nuclear president of the 20th century, which is rather remarkable given the other aspect of him. And so what I argue in the book is that this is part of potentially this sort of original sin of misunderstanding and his about what he thought the bombs were going to do versus what they did. But whatever the cause of it, one of the things you can find throughout his presidency is that what Truman is trying to do on the whole is deny the military access to these weapons because he does not trust them to understand them correctly, and to ideally shape the world in a way where these weapons are never going to be used again and maybe even are banned. He's actually pretty enthusiastic for a president about actually disarming if you could make it work. And it turns out you can't make it work, or couldn't then. But he's not even, until the Korean War, Truman does not even really believe that there's a Cold War. He sort of thinks we and the Russians, we can work this thing out. We are not necessarily opposed to each other all the way. Yes, they do things we don't like and we will counter them. And that's how it is because they're, you know, paranoid, but they'll eventually figure out that like we can coexist. And the Korean War makes him much more bitter and leads to a lot of other sort of policy changes that he's not very happy with, building up the arms race and things like that. But anyway, it's a very different version of Truman than I had ever heard before. This sort of very reluctant Truman and a very anti-nuclear Truman who, despite this, approves the building of the H-bomb, approves the building of new facilities to increase the arsenal. I mean, he ends up doing things that I think he's unhappy with for a variety of reasons, and I sort of explore them in the book. But the conclusion I took away is that this is a guy who is not enthusiastic about nuclear weapons in the slightest.
Yeah, no, and I made a note of that. Probably most anti-nuclear president of the 20th century, despite the public image of the nuclear president, you know? And I think a lot of pragmatism, you touched upon this idea that he does some things he doesn't necessarily feel like he wants to do. I feel like Korean War definitely is like the moment where things shift. You know, that's the vibe I
Yeah.
got reading your book. That you have this guy that's like fighting against it, and then you know this pragmatism comes in. He's like, you know what, like I have to be realistic about certain things, and I don't have to like it, but certain things have to go a certain way with relation to nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. Right? Would you say that the Korean War does become this moment?
It's interesting because Korea, similar to Berlin, the Berlin crisis in 48, it's the situation where Truman is in this sort of impossible position where the Soviets, in his mind and his advisors' minds, are doing this really terrible thing. In the case of the Korean War, this attack by North Korea onto the South, and this is perceived to be a Soviet policy and to be extremely aggressive, and he's not happy with this. But on the other hand, like he doesn't, nobody wants to jump into World War III. Not because it would end with the world being an apocalyptic ruin or anything. It's because World War III is going to be a very unpleasant war at this time if it happens. It's going to be World War II with some nuclear weapons. And Truman has been spending his entire presidency at this point trying to cut the military budget completely to the bone and transition into a fully peacetime world and things like this. He is not interested. Nobody's interested in a major investment. I mean, even the military really don't want to be in Korea because they don't care about Korea, frankly. They think that like Europe is interesting, important, Japan is important. Korea to them has almost no valuable resources, or it's not in that great of a position, et cetera. And yet he also feels this sort of moral obligation. When you look at what Truman says about like why they need to go into this war, it's because like, well, we made a promise to the South Korean people. We told them we would help them, and we don't, these are our friends and allies. We're not going to just back out. It's not necessarily this whole domino theory idea that if they take South Korea, they'll take other places. And even the military doesn't really believe that. They don't think South Korea is that important. But Truman just is like, well, we can't abandon these people, but we also don't want World War III. So we're going to get into this war with the United Nations basically, it's a UN action. So it's not even the United States technically being at war. And we're going to just fight for ideally restoring the uncomfortable situation we had before, right? Like we want to get back to this unideal situation. And I just, like, nobody is happy with this, right? The military don't want this. Like, what kind of end goal is that? You're not going to win. You're going to win by a little bit, but not that much. You can't win by too much, or else you might provoke World War III or China or something like that. And then also the people who don't want anybody to be at war, they're not happy about it, right? And like, to me, this is, in retrospect, like, this is the template for what the Cold War is like, right? It's this uncomfortable thing where you can't really win, but you also don't want to lose. And you're fighting for, you don't really know what the end state is that you're going for. And of course, the United States and the Soviets, they both have later conflicts that have this pattern to them, but they're so different from World War II, where things are really clear. Like, the end goal is defeat these people, take them over, and turn them into different countries, right? And that is not the goal of the Korean War. It can't be, because you can't do that without more expenditure of resources and loss of life than you're willing to tolerate. So, is it pragmatic? I tend to think that a lot of Truman's actions here, the way I would describe them, he has a sense of sort of civic virtue, like a civic morality. And I call it civic partially to make it secular. He's not like, he does cite the Bible a lot, but he's not citing the Bible for this kind of thing. It's more like, if you promise people, if you're a state and you promise people that you're going to have their back, you have to have their back. It's just what you do, not because if you don't do it in the future, people won't trust you, but because, like, you made a promise. And if you made a promise, you made a promise, and you have to follow through. There's a lot of Truman that is based in these kind of civic principles. Again, the buck stops here is another one. And they really drive actual behavior on his point and on his part. And it's not perfect. It's not like he has some stellar record where he always makes the right decision or he doesn't compromise. He compromises all the time, especially in domestic politics. And many of the decisions he makes are arguably not the right decisions, but like, I'm very impressed the more I studied him, again, and not as somebody who was all that interested in Truman as a person before working on the book. I was very interested that this actually seemed to be this anchor for him. And then it applies to the atomic bomb stuff as well, because like, slaughtering civilians is one of those things that he does not really believe you ought to be doing. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but he really, in the abstract, he considers this to be a real problem and something worth avoiding.
Yeah, it's like a man with honor. It's like a very old school way of, he lives according to a certain code, right? He has his own code in that sense. Uh, throughout, you said, like, Truman surprised you, but I guess my question is, when you're doing this research and you're working on this, was there any? I'm sure there was probably more than one, but can you think of like an aha moment that, as you're doing this research, you're like, oh, well, this is really cool. Like, you want to run downstairs and tell somebody about it, kind of thing, or something that shifted the way you thought about how this book was going to go. Just like one moment from this book, this research that kind of stopped you in your tracks, for good or for bad.
Yeah. So there's so many interesting things. So I'll give you two little examples. One little example, one bigger example. One was this very odd account I found in the diary of one of his cabinet members, David Lilienthal, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, which has been published. It's not like this is some hard source to get. It's a fascinating read. If you're interested in the 40s and you're interested in atomic anything, David Lilienthal's journals from the atomic energy years are just fascinating, because he wrote them every night. I think he dictated them, and they are very human. They're very well. At one point his dog dies, and he's trying to like manage all these crises and also grieve over his pet. And you're like, oh my god, so relatable. But and he's a fairly decent guy. A little bit of a pain in the neck sometimes, but very decent guy. But there's this moment in the spring of 1949 when Robert Oppenheimer, who was a good friend of Lilienthal's, comes to Lilienthal and he says, we just had the weirdest meeting with the president. And the we here is the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. And who met with the president occasionally. And he basically said, yeah, the president sort of thanked us for our service and said he appreciated us being here. And then he said that he thought that within the next 2 years, so by 1951, they would probably come to an agreement with the Soviet Union and ban all nuclear weapons. And so once that happens, they probably won't need them anymore, but they appreciate all the work they've done so far. And Oppenheimer's response is to go to Lilienthal, who knows Truman pretty well, and he's like, "Does Truman know something we don't? Because we don't see any reason to think that this has made any progress. What is going on here?" And Lilienthal doesn't know the answer. And it's such a weird little moment. And the more I look for those kinds of little revealing moments about what is Truman's mental state at any given time, especially in diary records, people who were seeing him firsthand. It's just such a it leads to a lot of interesting questions about what is on his mind. Of course, a few months later the Soviets test their first nuclear weapon. He's completely wrong, but it does indicate to me that one, he's early 49, he just won re-election. He may just be like really optimistic about things. But two, he really doesn't believe in the Cold War. He really doesn't believe the arms race is inevitable. He actually seems to think, and there's other stuff he does in this period, that like, we're going to work it all out. It's going to be great. We're going to actually like move past these disagreements and we don't even need nuclear weapons. It's going to be awesome. And he's so wrong, but this is the president of the United States and he's making these comments at very high level secret meetings. It's a very just interesting moment into reflecting on his mental state, which of course we can't know, but reconstructing it as part of the job here. The other little event, and this is one I went into the book, not really, I knew this thing had happened, but I didn't know exactly why. In April 1951, so after World War II, Truman basically removed all physical possession of nuclear weapons from the military. It's called the custody dispute. And he put it into the hands of the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission, and he would not give it back, even though the military repeatedly went to him and said, we really should have these weapons. We need to train with them. We need to get good at maintaining them. How are we going to use these if we don't have them? And Truman was like, I don't want you to have these weapons. You're not ready. This is not a good idea. And they had, over the years, waged a little campaign to slowly get control of weapons back one way or the other. And there's stepwise approach they took. But in April 51, he authorized giving them 9 nuclear cores. So these are the nuclear components that you would need for 9 nuclear weapons, not so different from the ones used on Nagasaki. And they were going to be transferred to Guam. And the question is, why? Why does he give them 9 weapons? What are these 9 weapons meant to do? Why are they 9? Why not 10? Why not 12? 9? 9 is a weird number, right? Like, why 9? And I thought that I went into the book thinking, well, there has to be a story here because this is very odd. It's the first time they got any weapons from Truman, and it's all the only weapons they had until I think 54 or something like that. Even into Eisenhower, they didn't have weapons. What's the story behind the 9? And I finally dug it all up. And it turns out that one, it's 9 because they were supposed to have 10 of these essentially atomic bombs without fuel on Guam anyway, because they've been starting to move these kinds of things around the world. But they blew one up on accident. And so they never replaced it. And I just thought like, wow, that is a real interesting thing in and of itself. You get 9 because you had 10, but you blew one up. So you got the exact number that you had at Guam and you never replaced the 10th one. So you didn't get another weapon. I just thought so interesting, the scarcity of these things. The other is I became convinced, and there are some other historians who have thought this as well, but the more I went over it, why does he give them these weapons? It's not because he's intending for them to be used. He doesn't actually give them to the part of the military that could use them in the Korean War. 9 weapons by themselves is not that much compared to their war plans. It doesn't do that much for you. It's not some imminent thing. He's very clear when he signs them over that they are not allowed to use them. He's basically just giving them this opportunity to have them. And the answer is it's exactly the same time he's trying to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are the ones who requested the weapon, to agree with him on firing MacArthur. And so it's this quid pro quo exchange. Okay, you have a thing you've wanted for a long time from me, and I've refused them to you. And I know that these are not that important in the big picture, but you will understand correctly that I am throwing you a bone, and this is going to help you in the future. And I will do that in exchange for you doing this thing that you really don't want to do, which is to toss one of your generals. You don't like him that much, but like the military does not like tossing their generals, right? And if you do this, everybody's happy. And immediately the military basically flip around and say, like, sure, we can get rid of MacArthur. And I think that is so revealing. This is this thing that you could misread this. You could think, oh, well, Truman wants to use the bomb again. He has no intention of using the bomb. It's this domestic political squabble. And then that is leading him to make this policy decision that he probably doesn't really like making. But that's the sort of resolution of it for him. That's a very Truman kind of thing. This thing that looks like high level strategy is really about like making sure you have the domestic support that you need if you're going to push this unpopular policy through.
It seems like Truman might have jumped on your list of favorite or least favorite presidents. He must have moved. He might have moved a little bit during this research process, right?
Well, yeah. I try to maintain, distance, and my least favorite biographies of anybody are the ones where they conclude something like, "If only this person was around today, they would know how to fix
Oh, yeah.
things." And that's like incorrect,
Yeah, no.
wrong. But
Yes,
like
no.
same thing with yeah. But I did come away with a lot more respect for him than I initially had. I feel like both the people who have traditionally like supported Truman and the people who have traditionally been detractors of him both get him wrong in interesting ways. He's not like this harsh cold warrior guy who you might think that's the right approach. You might think that's good. He's also not this, I don't know, callous military industrial creature who wants to build things up and sabotage the Soviets and all these kinds of things. He's this kind of regular guy with a few very strong sort of civic beliefs who finds himself in a job that he, by his own he's willing to admit, is totally unprepared for. He has no foreign policy experience. He knows how to pass legislation and do a few other things domestically, but he does not really know this job at all. He has not been trained for it at all. Roosevelt did not prepare him at all. And he's thrown into these crazy circumstances. And they're not only like the normal crazy circumstances you might have of becoming president all of a sudden, they're like, oh, also there's super weapons, and also the Soviet Union has emerged as the only other superpower, and we have to figure out what the next way forward is, or else really horrible things will happen. And he's kind of groping his way through that. And again, does he do it all correctly? Of course not, right? Does that all work out for the best? I don't know. It could be worse, but maybe it could have been better too. It wasn't like it ended in some like great moment or anything. But I had a lot of respect that at the heart of what he was doing was usually some kind of moral or civic virtue that I could sign on to. And that he was willing to operationalize these things, and he was willing to sometimes do things that were pretty unpopular if he thought that it was really necessary to do that. And I don't know, I appreciate that. I feel like that's kind of what you want in a leader. Even if you don't agree with everything they do, you want them to be sort of guided by some sort of fundamental principles, even if they compromise sometimes, which they have to. It's politics, right? But to be driven by, his essential goal for most of his presidency is like, can we have peace? Can we just not go back to war again? We just got out of this horrible war. Can we make a world where that isn't going to happen? That would be great. Can we not slaughter people if we don't need to, or if it's absolutely avoidable? The president has responsibility for what happens under their administration. Has, for the time, very liberal views about things like civil rights. Like, again, does it all work out? No, of course not. But like, this is pretty good for the 1940s. Is he have beliefs that one would not agree with? Of course he does. It's the 1940s. He's a man of his time. But yeah, I came away thinking like he's actually okay. Like he's pretty good about a lot of things. I'm willing to, again, I'm not like some big Truman, rah, best president ever guy, but he was really unpopular when he left office, tremendously unpopular, one of the most unpopular presidents ever leave office. And, he had a sort of resurgence in the 1970s. And again, that's often for reasons I'm not super comfortable with. But I feel like he's been sort of done wrong, and that he's more interesting and has more in his favor than I think a lot of people appreciate.
That's awesome. Alex, thank you so much for doing this today. This was a great interview. I'll make sure I put all the links in there in the description of this, but this was a great interview. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.